Well, let's go ahead and get started in a moment. I know we'll probably have some more folks straggle in, but I should go ahead and get started so we can move on to your small group time. Um, so, all of last month, we kind of charted through King David's stories, and by doing that, we were able to work through a very common but rarely acknowledged reality in the Bible, and that is that most stories in the Bible are told more than once. And that they often, in fact, I would say almost always, have different theological perspectives about the story. So we saw that with David in terms of the stories from Samuel and Kings were pretty much tell all and tell stuff you don't even want to hear. And Chronicles kind of whitewashed it all, kind of cleaned things up. And there were theological reasons for that, and you all have plenty of time to talk about those things. So today you might be relieved to know that today's story is only told this time in Matthew. So you might be relieved. Okay, we don't have to struggle with all that, except this may not be the one-time exception that you're hoping for. Because when you look at the passages, Matthew, who compiles these sayings from Jesus, and it's an important thing to realize that Jesus did not write any of the Gospels. Like, none of the Gospels were written by Jesus. So somebody else compiled Jesus's teachings, either heard those teachings, wrote them down, or received them from somebody else who wrote them down, put them together. Luke himself, when he begins his gospel, says that many other people have tried to tell the story about Jesus. And I, Luke, have tried to find all the stories I could find so that I could tell the story best. Meaning, of course, he thought his gospel was better than the other ones. And we know he copied Mark's. He was saying mine's better than Mark's, but, anyways. So Matthew brings three separate things together. With the parable, which is the focus today. But before the parable, there are two kind of setup stories for the parable. And so one of the things you're going to struggle with and look at is that these setup stories and the parable do not agree with each other about forgiveness. So even though what I'm giving you today is this, the only time in the whole Bible this is here is in Matthew. This is the only time this is here. But the way Matthew puts it together, he creates the same kind of conversation and dialogue that we found last month with David between Samuel and Chronicles. So let's kind of, with that in mind, let's jump into it. The parable we're going to focus on today is the parable of the unforgiving servant. But to do that, we want to do this. We'll look at the setup stories. So if you flip your page, I'm assuming we don't have anybody new here today, so everybody knows where to go. So I'll have to explain that. Flip the page, you will see the passages. And so we're going to start with the first story is in verses 15 through 20. In this, there's a short interaction. Somebody has sinned from the church. So notice the red ink I've given you. If your brother or sister sins against you, flip down to the next paragraph. Peter came to him and said, Lord, if my brother or sister sins against me. So these two setup stories are answering the same question. In the first situation, what happens is that the church is supposed to give somebody three different chances to apologize, to make amends, to be forgiven. So in this situation, in the same situation, what Jesus is saying is there's this three-step process. First, if you sin against somebody and you bring this up to them, you're supposed to have a conversation one-to-one with them, a private conversation. Don't put it out there for everybody. Your first attempt is privately to make things right with this person. If that doesn't work, then you're supposed to get two or three people of good character, and together you all see if you can make that work. If that doesn't work, you bring them before the whole church. So you get three chances, this three-step process. So what's fascinating is the next story Remember, the first story is said, if your brother or sister sins against you, what are you supposed to do? The next story is Peter comes to Jesus, Lord, if my brother or sister sins against me, how many times should I forgive them? Peter thinks he's being very righteous. He says, should I forgive them 7 times? Which you got to admit is pretty generous, right? You think in your own life, how many times is somebody going to do something against me 5, 6, 7 times? How many times am I going to like jump into that and say, yes, I've got to forgive them 7 times? So Peter's already thinking he's pretty religious here, pretty righteous, pretty faithful, doing above and beyond surely what Jesus can ask of him. But Jesus' response is, no, I tell you, 77 times or 70 times 7. It could be either way. In both cases, whether it's 77 times or 70 times 7, it means stop, don't even bother counting. Don't even bother counting. Which is a different response than the first story, right? The first story said you're going to forgive somebody 1 time, but at least give them 3 chances to come around, right? Very different thing. So it's probably doubtful Jesus said these 2 setup stories at the same time, okay? Different answers. But at the end of the second setup story, at the beginning of the parable, after the second setup story, Jesus says, for this reason. So Matthew is connecting all 3 of these things. The first 2 setup stories have the same beginning line. And then the parable says, for this reason. So what we've just said is going to go into the parable. Now, what's interesting to me is that even though these stories seem to contradict each other, Matthew chooses to keep them all. One of the things I'm thinking is, I think this is probably testimony that you may realize in your own life. That is, forgiveness is hard. And it wasn't any easier in Jesus' day. And when the church, when Matthew and the other gospel writers were trying to figure out how do we understand forgiveness, they had to take Jesus' sayings and figure out what do we tell people. And so you have 2 setup stories which disagree with each other, and then we get this parable. So let's hop into the parable. Literally, this is a long parable. It has 3 acts, which is a rarity in a parable, and they follow a similar threefold pattern. So there is a statement, and there is a response, and there is judgment. And this repeating part of the plot acts as in anticipation for the hearers, okay? If you're hearing this story, you get the first round, and then when you see the second round coming back, you think, okay, I think I know what's going to happen here, right? You do the same thing when you watch television shows or movies, right? So Act 1 is found in Matthew 23 through 27. A king wishes to settle his accounts. We can assume these are tax accounts, and his servants are his tax collectors. One of his servants is brought before him to give account on the taxes he has collected. He owes the king 10,000 talents. This is a fantasy amount, okay? I know we don't deal with talents, we deal with US dollars, but this is a fantasy amount. So no tax collector in Jesus's day in Palestine, Israel, could owe a king that much money. An actual record of King Herod's tax years shows that he at most collected 900 talents in a year. So if King Herod, in his whole little principality, is collecting 900 talents, taking what he needs and passing the rest on to Rome, and another person, a Jewish historian named Josephus, some of you all may have come across Josephus in studies of the Bible. Josephus one time wrote that the annual tax collection of the Palestine region, assuming he did not mean King Herod's principality, was only 600 talents. So we have 2 historical documents that tell us kind of what was the average amount that these principalities in this region would collect. And you got 600 talents and 900 talents, but this person owes 10,000. It's a fantasy. Okay, this is an exaggeration, hyperbole. So there's no way possible that this person could owe this much, but Jesus is telling the story in such a way to get you think about a point. He's trying to make a point in the story. So the amount is an exaggeration for an literary effect. And you never thought English class would help you with life, right? So this is an exaggerated for a literary effect. The king pronounces judgment, and since there's no way this person can pay, he is going to be sold along with his wife and children so that at least the king can make some money. The servant begs for mercy, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything," which is a bunch of BS, right? This guy's nowhere. He could live 1,000 years. He's not going to pay this off, right? The crowd knows this man can't pay this off. Okay, they know this. We're talking to peasants. They understand this fantasy amount. There's no way anybody owes this much money to the king. Nevertheless, the king forgives his debt. So here we have the first plot twist. Because when we think of kings, we're not thinking of mercy, right? Once you got somebody with all that power, you don't expect mercy. So the first plot twist is the king first forgives a debt, period, but now he forgives a debt that could hardly be imagined and that nobody can pay back. Act 2 is found in Matthew 28 through 30. The servant, thus freed from his impossible debt and having just escaped a sentence of slavery for him and for his family, walks outside a free man. And as chance would happen, right? Chance always happens in storytelling, right? As chance would have it. He meets a fellow servant who owes him a little bit of money. The amount here mentioned would probably be about 3 months' wages for a peasant, not an insignificant amount, but certainly not 10,000 talents. Like the king, he demands payment. Act 2 is proceeding in the same way Act 1 proceeded. This fellow servant begs for mercy, promising to pay the debt. Again, Act 2 follows Act 1. Therefore, plot-wise, we should be ready for this man to be gracious and understanding and forgive this debt because he's just been forgiven. That's the way the story is proceeding. But now plot 2 twist enters the story. The servant who had been forgiven an impossible debt in which he and his family would be sold off into slavery now will not forgive this servant a smaller debt and has him thrown into prison. Act 2 breaks with Act 1. Actually, what happened in Act 2 is what we'd expected to happen in Act 1, because we don't expect kings to be merciful, right? Act 3 is found in verses 31 through 34. Some busybodies watched all of this happen, right? When you tell a good story, you got to have some busybodies around to watch what happened so the plot can keep on. So the busybodies are watching what happened, and these tattletalers go and tell the king what they saw. The king has his men find the first servant, bring him back to them, and the story began with the king pronouncing judgment upon him, but now having been granted mercy, he is right back where he started from. So Act 3 takes us back to Act 1. The king has the man tortured until he could pay the entire debt, which would be never, right? He couldn't pay it off even when we could go out and work for it, right? How's he going to pay it off being tortured someplace? So the king's judgment is also an exaggeration. It is also hyperbole, right? Because the 10,000 talents is hyperbole. So the punishment is hyperbole on top of that. It's trying to get us into a literary effect to respond in some way. Act 3 turns the forgiveness in Act 1 upside down. Jesus' parable tells us what happens when we do not forgive. I mean, that's what this parable story is about. It begins with the good stuff. Forgiveness happens. And then the rest of the story is what happens when we don't forgive. What happens when we turn mercy into judgment? We end up in a hateful, dystopian world where our unmerciful hearts have created. By the end of the story, Jesus turns everything upside down, as he often does in parables. The king, who changed from judgment to mercy, now becomes even harsher than he was at the beginning of the story. A forgiven man loses his forgiveness and is condemned to a terrible punishment worse than he would have had received to begin with. The second servant is still in prison, right? I mean, there's nothing in the story that says the king gets him out, right? He's still in prison. Like, that's not part of the story. He's still stuck there. And the busybodies have turned into snitches and watched the king's wrath reach terrible proportions. Nobody wins living under a wrathful despot. It turns us all into snitches on one another. This is what happens when we don't live in a forgiving world. This is what happens when we refuse to forgive. Now, Jesus' concluding statement, "So my heavenly Father will do to you if you do not forgive your brother and sister," is also problematic because it kind of re-emphasizes the ending of the parable, which is terrible and seems to be at odds with the preceding story, which Jesus said, "For this reason, I'm telling you the story, to forgive 70 times 7. Which leaves us saying, what's going on here? Which is what you get to talk about, right? So, any questions about what I presented before you go off to your groups?